Hello again, everyone. I'm just going to record the short little, I don't know, might not end up being so short, the supplemental lecture on language of thought, which we were supposed to cover it earlier in class on Tuesday, but we didn't quite get to it. So instead, this whole bonus lecture is going to be about language of thought and the language of thought hypothesis. So the background is this is the lecture that comes directly after the final lecture on the representational theory of mind. And I kind of rushed at the end, talking about what some of the benefits of representational theory of mind are. And so I just wanted to finish off by saying what a few of the benefits of RTM are, talking about the benefits will then transition us into a discussion of language of thought and why that theory is a view and how it fits in with this more general discussion of representational theory of mind. So the background is, I just want to talk about with RTM, the main things we said that according to RTM, what it is to have a belief or something is to have a certain functional relationship to a mental symbol, and a mental symbol with a particular meaning. So to have the belief that it's going to rain is you have the mental symbol, it's going to rain, it has that meaning, whatever that is. And then you just have it, you interact with that token symbol in your head in the believy sort of way. And so the main benefits of thinking about this sort of way, something I touched on, is one, it's able to explain complex mental activities in simple mechanical terms. And this is what I was talking about with the computer analogy. And so just the idea is that if you accept representational theory of mind, then you can explain the magic that is complex human thought without having to talk about magical souls or things that exist outside the physical world. You're just saying that there's something about a brain that allows it to run this sort of symbol manipulation program. And by program, I mean almost like a computer program. And that's the way in which we're able to explain incredibly complex thought in terms of simple ideas of symbols and symbol manipulation. And again, the system itself doesn't have to know what those symbols refer to. All it has to know how to do is move the symbols around. So in the same way where if you have a rule that tells you turn a square into a circle, you don't have to know what the square symbolizes or what the circle symbolizes. All you have to do is change those symbols around. So the system itself can be very dumb, but as long as those symbols refer to other things in the world in the right way, then they can explain complex thought and complex mental activity. The second one I wanted to say is, and I kind of touched on this at the end, is accepting the representational theory of mind links the mind and psychology to biology and evolution. So what's the benefit of this? Well, if we rewind to earlier in the semester, one of the things that motivated behaviorists and one of the things that motivates the eliminative materialists is this idea that we want psychology to be a real science. We want it to line up with other sorts of sciences, fit in with them, and be able to explain things in the same law-like ways. Well, I said at the end that if you accept representational theory of mind, you have to explain certain things like where the basic rules of thought come from. So if you know A and B, so if you know A and B, then one thing you know by itself is A, and one thing you know by itself is B. What is it that you can infer a member of a conjunction from the conjunction? Well, according to representational theory of mind, that sort of low-level thing is built into your thinking system, and it's built into thinking by evolution. So one of the benefits of this is it gives an explanation of the mind in evolutionary and biological terms. And if we can explain mind in evolutionary and biological terms, or it links up with those theories, then it's starting to look a lot more like the object of psychology, the mind understood in genuine folk psychological terms, is something that we can do science on. Behaviorists weren't correct that it's just a matter of feelings and a matter of like wishy-washy, crap, which is what behaviorists want to say talk of thoughts and minds are. Rather, representational theory of mind, if you go in this way, it's saying, no, there's a reason that this stuff works, and it's because it's selected for, and it's just as real as something like a heart. Why do we have a heart? Well, a heart was an evolutionary solution to a problem of getting nutrients to other parts of a larger body. Well, in the same way, what is a mind? A mind is an evolutionary response to problem solving on the part of an organism over generations and generations and generations. So it's no longer looking like the mind is some mysterious thing. For those of you who have taken philosophy, other philosophy classes and read Descartes' view of the mind, for Descartes, the mind was something that you couldn't even, it was beyond the physical world. You couldn't do science on the mind. It hooked up to the physical world, but it didn't make sense. Well, now representational theory of mind is saying that's not right. We're saying we can get the complex sort of stuff that Descartes is talking about. There might be some things we can't explain, like consciousness or things like that. But in terms of thought itself, how we draw conclusions, how we reason, that can be explained as a byproduct of evolution and biology. Therefore, psychology is a science. It lines up with the other sciences. Part of the reason why physics and chemistry are considered both sciences, one, they're incredibly powerful, but also they link up to each other. Chemistry is in some, or physics is in some sense more basic, and the laws of chemistry can be understood as being cashed out in terms of the laws of physics. In the same way, biology in some sense can be explained in terms of chemistry and physics. And now this is saying, well, the mind, the thought can be explained in terms of biology, which could then be explained in terms of physics, or chemistry and physics, etc. So another advantage is if you accept RTM and you start thinking about the mind as a machine or as a computer, then it can line up with other sciences, which lends credence to this view that cognitive science, the science of the mind, is something that we can actually study. All right, so those are the first two benefits. The third one, which is going to transition us into talk of the language of thought, is that it guides further research. So whenever you're doing science, a good scientific theory doesn't just like give you a way that the world is. It's the beginning of a project. You can begin to ask and understand how particular things get affected. So what am I talking about? Well, part of the reason that the theory of like evolution is so powerful is that it opens up whole new research questions. You can now ask things like, how many generations does it take for an organism's behaviors to change based on evolutionary pressures? What sorts of pressures will affect an organism and what won't? What is the mechanism? What sort of thing carries the information that gets passed on from generation to generation? So for instance, the reason people were looking for DNA or genes as something to understand is you first have to understand what biology is. And once you understand biology, you're asking what evolution is. So until you have evolution, it makes no sense to look for genes or to look for DNA as a substance, because it only matters, those things, the Watson and Crick's discussions of what DNA was like and ideas of how that was the thing that carries information from generation to generation, those questions only really make sense in the framework of evolutionary theory. So evolutionary theory, part of its breakthrough is it's asking further questions and guiding research in new ways. And it is kind of the foundation from which we can learn even more stuff. In the same way, why was Newtonian physics such a breakthrough? Well, now all of a sudden people could start asking new questions about, well, if mass, if gravity is the thing that things with mass are in some sense getting pulled together, well, we can begin to ask questions about how much. We can begin to do engineering projects in which things like this closeness of some other large object is going to affect the things we're trying to build. Or on a subatomic level, once relativity theory came along and the idea that the faster something's moving is going to affect the amount of time that like the way speed affects time and gravity affects time. And once you start working with very small particles in subatomic physics, you can start taking these things into account. When you're asking other questions, you can ask how much, if I'm building a computer chip, how much does the fact that I'm moving at this speed as I'm designing it, will that affect the mechanism of my computer? These are the questions that you're able to ask. So in the same way, another benefit of representational theory of mind is it guides what other questions you can ask. It turns some just thinking about, here's the mind, into something where you can be like, all right, here's one question we need to ask. We need to ask things like, what rules do humans follow? What is the method by which we think? What are the rules the symbols follow? You can ask questions like, how many symbols are in the head? Do we add new symbols, or have they always been in there from the beginning? Which are the rules? We said in class, some of the rules have to be in there already. Which ones are in there? Which rules of thought are hardwired, and which ones do we acquire? If we're acquiring new ones, how do we do it? How do these symbols tie up with things like vision? When I have what is the relationship between seeing something and coming to have a belief about the thing that you saw? How do those things match up? Are the symbols that you have in your thought also symbols that are in some sense seen? Like, what is the relationship between the content of vision and the content of thought? These are all the sorts of questions that arise. And so one of the major things that makes representational theory of mind so powerful is it turns an interesting philosophical topic. And it basically, if you accept this, you can turn folk psychology of our ordinary belief desire into a full-blown science in which you have a lot more questions to ask. And so this is where the transition comes in. One of the final questions we have is, what is the nature of mental symbols? And by this, I mean, what are the symbols like? What more can we say about the symbols? So I'm going to erase this in a second. I just want to leave this up here. Basically, the transition into talking about language of thought this week and then talking about dual system theory next week is you can think of these as multiple questions about the question, what are the nature of the mental symbols in the head? So we just erase this. We've said, according to the representational theory of mind, here's the human brain, or human head. This is the mind. This symbolizes the mind or the head. And here's our person. And we've said that to have a thought about something is to have a symbol that represents that thought in the head. So this is our symbol. This is the mental content that there's a tree, let's say. Oop, it's getting blurry on me. There we go. Let's say this is the mental content, there's a tree. Well, what is it to have that mental content? It's for, or no, let's not go with there's a tree. Let's call this the mental content. Let me think of a good one. This is John. This is John being happy, and John these are the worst hearts ever, but you get the general gist. John loves George. So in this case, this is our mental content. That's the symbol in our head. This is a nose, by the way, if you're wondering what that is. And this symbol is, this has the content that John loves George. Now, this is all just plain old representational theory of mind. But here's a question. What is this symbol like? And so this is where the language of thought discussion comes along. And this is what Fodor, in the very tongue-in-cheek, is discussing as the difference in the view between himself, so we'll just put up Fodor, and Auntie. And Auntie is his character that he invents to be quite silly. And this is designed, oops. Come on, focus on me. All right, it's taking a second to get unblurry. Sure, there we go. All right, so I'm just gonna have to stay back here to make sure it stays. So for Fodor, in the Why There Still Has to Be a Language of Thought article, he is arguing him and Auntie are disagreeing about the nature of this. Now, just to symbolize, And he goes through nicely in the article of explaining the language of thought hypothesis in opposition to those who accept many of the same things, but have a crucial difference about this. So let's actually draw two different people. This is going to be Auntie's view. And then I'm going to draw Fodor's view down here. And this is to show what the crucial difference between the language of thought and non-language of thought, still representational theories of mind. So you can think of it as this is a disagreement amongst people who, based on the term anti with Fodor, are related to each other. So Fodor. Now, Fodor and Anti are two people who both believe that what's in the head and what's in the world, there are symbols in the head, and those symbols in the world are, or the states in the world are represented by symbols in the head. So that's one thing. Thus far, everything is the same as what's going on in the picture. What makes this mental representation true? So if you were to put this in a belief box, if you believed that John loves George, what would it be? It would be for this symbol with this content to represent the fact that John loves George and have that in your belief box. In the same way, Fodor says that to have a belief that John loves George, there's going to be a mental symbol in the belief box that represents that. Furthermore, both Anti and Fodor agree that the things that make our representations true are complex. So the state of affairs out in the world that represents whether John loves George, or the thing that, if I have the belief that John loves George, what makes it true that John loves George are facts about John and a separate set of facts about George and their relation. So there's going to be multiple parts. There's going to be John, there's going to be George, there's going to be loving. Out in the world, there are multiple things out there that are responsible. These are still all in agreement. The difference comes in here. This is the difference between language of thought hypothesis, people who subscribe to the language of thought, and those that do not. And this is the question of what are the symbols like? For Anti, a symbol of this state of affairs is a complete whole. You cannot divide this any further. This thing is a single indivisible whole, the representational content that represents an external world. For Fodor, every mental symbol that refers to an entire state of affairs is itself comprised of smaller symbol parts. So according to Fodor, there's not a single thing that responds to this. It's rather going to be something like this. It's going to be something like a sentence in a language. There's going to be one part of your mental representation. This is the part that specifically corresponds to John. Then you're going to have another part, call it this symbol. What does this refer to? Well, this picks out the relationship of liking. And then what about this one here? This symbol picks out George. So in the same sense that Anti thinks there's a representational symbol in the head that picks out that John loves George, Fodor thinks the same thing. There is a symbol in the head. The difference is this symbol is a unit comprised of smaller symbol unit parts. This is what the language of thought hypothesis is. It's entirely going to be a debate between people who think that thoughts themselves, the symbols that we use and the symbols that we put into our belief box, whether they're things that can be broken up into parts, smaller parts that themselves have representational content, or whether it's just entire states of affairs that correspond to entire symbols in the head. So when Fodor's talking about the language of thought, his idea is just that in the same way that a sentence in a language is made up of words and that they get combined together in accordance with certain rules to determine what they semantically refer to or what their meaning is, in the same way, the mind is made up of parts the symbols in the mind are themselves smaller parts that get combined together, and they then get, each part corresponds to something, or each part has semantic content. And in virtue of that semantic content of the parts, the wholes get their whole semantic content. So this entire thing is what refers to the fact that John loves George. It's just that you can subdivide it. For Auntie, that cannot be subdivided. There is no smaller thing than the entire representational symbol that corresponds to the entire state of affairs. So when Fodor's talking about what is the language of thought at the start of his why there still has to be a language of thought hypothesis, this is what he's discussing. The what's on the table, the question is, what is the nature of the symbols that correspond to things in the world? What is the nature of mental symbols? Are they indivisible wholes that have their representational properties as a unit and an indivisible unit and essentially? Or is it that each one is a complex whole made up of smaller parts, each of which is itself representational? So note several things at this point. One, this entire discussion only makes sense within the context of the representational theory of mind. In a eliminative materialist, this question is not even askable for them. They don't believe that there are mental symbols, so they can't have a debate about what the mental symbols are like. It's also not something that a behaviorist could even have a discussion about. For a behaviorist, we never talk about what's in the head. So there's nothing to debate about whether Auntie's right or whether Fodor's right. So it's only if you accept the representational theory of mind as your explanation for why folk psychology works, only then do you start to have questions like, what is the relationship here between, like, what is the nature of the mental symbols? Are they indivisible wholes, like Auntie says, or are they individual parts that together comprise a whole, but each part can be broken off, like Fodor says? So what I want to do here is, now this is the general picture. I want to talk about what the substantive difference of this is. Well, here's the main difference. There are two main differences. One, which of these two pictures you accept is going to affect how you think thinking itself works. And this is why the discussion of language of thought is not just about the symbols. It's also about how thinking works. And this is why it's a question that is interesting beyond just, is the mind doing language, is the mind not doing language? Like that by itself is just like, oh, who cares how the symbols are shaped? Well, the reason is, if thinking is, as the representational theory of mind assumes, causal transitions from one mental symbol to another, then what thinking is like is going to depend on what mental symbols are like. So let me say this. Let's leave up George and John, and then let's just talk about, for Fodor and for Auntie, what thinking about George and John is going to consist of. For Auntie, this is what the thought looks like. It's just a single indivisible whole that corresponds to this. But for Fodor, it's circle, this, and then I think I had a box. So this is what the thought looks like. Now, here are some things. If this is an indivisible whole, you cannot take parts of this away, and you cannot swap them out. And the only sort of thinking you can have, if you accept a non-language of thought, is for one entire mental symbol to correspond to another one. So for instance, for John and George, if you wanted to have the following thought, here's a regular train of thought you might have in this context. I stepped forward again, so of course everything's messed up. Come on, stop being blurry on me. I don't know why the camera's not working. All right, I'm just gonna go with a slightly blurry camera. Hopefully it'll sort itself out. It's all big symbols. You should be able to see it, even if it's somewhat messy. So if you say that all thinking is transitioning from one mental symbol to another, then imagine this train of thought. If you are someone like Auntie and you want to, here's a normal train of thought. John loves George, therefore somebody loves George. Well, for Auntie, what you're going to have to say is that this is the symbol for John loves George, and you're going to have a totally different symbol that corresponds to somebody loves George. Call it this symbol. That's our symbol for somebody loves George. So if you want to symbolize what it is to think, is to the transition from John loves George to somebody loves George. These are entire symbols that correspond to entire states of affairs. It's going to look something like, I'm actually going to erase this. So Auntie's going to be in blue, and Fodor's going to be in black. So Auntie's line of thinking here is that to have the thought that John loves George, and then from there to reason that therefore someone loves George, is to go from one mental symbol to another mental symbol. That's all it can be, because mental symbols cannot be subdivided. This blurry camera is really pissing me off, sorry. That's why I'm like kind of distracted. Let's see if I can. Whatever, I'm gonna have to get used to it. All right. This is what thinking is on the anti-view, the view that there's not a language of thought. Yes, the world out there is going to be a complicated place with complicated mental or complicated states of affairs made up of parts, but the symbols that correspond to those parts are whole. So this is what thinking looks like, whole symbol to whole symbol. But what about for someone who accepts the language of thought? Well, for someone with a language of thought, this is not an indivisible whole. Rather, it's going to look like this. This is John. This is the symbol for loving. And this is the symbol for George. I think I said it was box. Yeah. So if you are Fodor and you accept that this complex union is the relationship, you can think of it as a sentence. This is why he speaks of the language of thought. You've got the individual symbol for John, the symbol for loving, and the symbol for George. And in this particular order, it means that John loves George. Well, if your thinking goes from John loves George to somebody loves George, if you're going to describe this train of thought using Fodor's language, you don't have to totally begin from scratch. Rather, if you're saying John loves George, and somebody loves George, two of the parts in those sentences are the same. Which two parts? The loving and the George. So the thought would actually, for Fodor, look something like this. You have a symbol for love, which transitions into the conclusion as well. And the symbol for George is the same. The only thing that changes is the symbol for, you substitute out the symbol for John, and instead you substitute in the symbol for somebody. So this is the main difference then between the language of thought hypothesis and the not language of thought hypothesis. It's a bit more of a substantive difference than just the symbols themselves being whole or having parts, because whether the symbol has holes or is an indivisible whole or is comprised of parts is going to affect what thinking transitions are possible. If you're Fodor and you accept the language of thought, then you can explain thinking in terms of these smaller units that can be carried over from thought to thought. So if I think that John loves George, the reason I can think that somebody loves George is because I can copy over the loving and I can copy over the George content, and I just have to change around one of the symbols. Auntie can't do that. Auntie has to say you have one thought with one content, and what it is to think is to have a totally different thought in terms of its symbol is going to be very different. It's just that the one causes the other in the right sort of way such that it happens to preserve the truth. So first, you get a little more explanatory power out of the Fodor style language of thought hypothesis approach. Now, one consequence of this is that thinking on the non-language of thought hypothesis ends up being transitional between entire like nodes in a network. And the way that it ends up, people have been able to show that if you accept like the full-on nodes as having corresponding to representational properties and not having the parts, you're actually able to get a lot of explanatory power. And instead, the way it works, and we're going to talk about this more once we get to, actually, we'll probably touch on some connectionist models and associationism later, but the idea is that this is not a done deal, that this sort of picture is totally out, because what you can end up doing is you can say that there can be weights between how likely this symbol is to cause this symbol, or whether this symbol in a context with another symbol together cause this. But note that it's never because this symbol has the same parts as this symbol. For anti, you cannot have a case in which these have shared parts, because by their definition, mental symbols don't have parts. Another benefit of this view, which is going back to a point made in class today, this sort of picture in terms of individual symbols doesn't really match up that well with what's going on in the brain. We think of the brain as made up of individual neurons that either fire or don't fire, and fire in certain patterns. That doesn't look like each neuron is essentially looks the same as every other neuron. So it's harder in some sense to conceptualize how a system of neurons could be running something like this. But it's pretty easy to think where if each neuron or cluster of neurons corresponds to an entire state of affairs, then this cluster of neurons causing this cluster of neurons to fire makes a little more sense. If this didn't make total sense right here, that's okay. As I said, my allergies are killing me today. So hopefully, though, this is the crux difference. To accept the language of thought is to think that mental symbols, the things that correspond to whole states of affairs, are themselves comprised of smaller symbols that themselves can be manipulated. And if the symbols can themselves be manipulated, then thinking can consist of changing the sub-symbols within larger symbols. Well, for somebody who doesn't accept the language of thought, it has to be moved from entire symbol to entire symbol to entire symbol, where each entire symbol corresponds to an entire state of affairs that can be true or false. Well, this one can just change single parts out. So the entire state of affairs is changed because just some of the parts are changed out. So this could be the relationship of John loves George. This right here, here's another one. This would be our way of representing that George loves George. This would be the way of representing that George loves John. And each of these are just reusing the same symbols in different orders. For Fodor, you need, or for anti, you need 3 different symbols. This one corresponds to this. You'd have to have a brand new symbol, say, that corresponds to this one. You'd have another symbol. And so the way the mind would work on this view is it would be a collection of different representational symbols in the head. This is the anti-view. And then what it is to think is to move from one node in the network to another. So this is your, go with across. So this is the thought that somebody loves George. What is it to have the thought that John loves George, therefore somebody loves George? Well, it's just to go in this way. It's to have this symbol here cause this symbol to be tokened. What is it to have the belief that George loves George, therefore someone loves George? Well, that's to have this symbol here causally connect to that symbol. This one gets activated, then that one gets activated. Compare that with, so these are going to be different symbols. On a language of thought theory, the way it's going to work is you first off have the symbol for John, then you have the symbol for love, then you have the symbol for George, and then this as a unit, this one just gets copied down, same instance of the same symbol a second time. This is George, and then this is the someone symbol. So someone loves George. These 2 symbols gets carried down, and this one gets subbed out for a different one. So it's the same idea. You still have a symbol that corresponds to this. It's just how it's implemented is different. And now, why should you give a damn about these differences? What is the point of these differences? Like, why should you care? Well, at the end of the day, if you're studying psychology, you've already accepted that you want to understand how the human mind works. And this question here of how the symbols correspond to the external world and which the symbols are and which ones are simple and which are complex. If you already accept that we want to understand how the mind works, then understanding which type of symbols there are is the crux of understanding how the mind works. You can't understand what thinking is or how thinking works if you don't already accept that, if you don't get clear about what the symbols are like and what the transitions between them are like. To understand thinking is to understand the transitions from symbol to symbol. And to understand the transition from symbol to symbol, you have to know what the symbols are like. All right, I need to find my water bottle. Give me 1 second. All right, I can't find it. I guess we're coming back. I'll find it after this lecture. All right, so that's the difference between language of thought and non-language of thought. So it's not a settled question as to whether language of thought is right. However, a lot of people accept it. And what I want to do now here briefly at the end is talk about Fodor's reasons for thinking that the language of thought is a good hypothesis about how language works. That is, or how the mind works. Should we think that the symbols in the mind are made up of smaller symbols that can be moved around? Well, he gives 3 different reasons for thinking that it should. The first of them is this idea that we engage in complex behaviors, and it's easier to engage in explain how we engage in complex behaviors if you think of each individual behavior having its own individual symbol that corresponds to it. And if that's the case, then there's clearly going to have to be parts to your mental symbols. So remember, the background is someone like Antti says there's no parts to our corresponding mental symbols. Fodor wants to say, yes, there are. And so this is his TKO argument. This is probably I find his third argument the most interesting one. I just want to briefly touch on these since I had you read them. So his argument is this. Imagine first off that you have the following. You have an intention to lift your arm, and then so a cause, and then the effect. Your intention, you have the effect, your arm raises. Now, imagine you have a second intention to hop on 1 foot, and then what does that cause? Hop on 1 foot. Now imagine you have a third case. You form the intention to, so let's actually label these. Intention 1 caused your arm to raise. So this is intention 1. Intention 2 is the intention to do this. And then intention 3 leads to the behavior arm up and hop on 1 foot. So how does this argument from Fodor work? How is this an argument for the language of thought? Well, he's trying to show that Antti's wrong, that mental symbols can't have parts, or that we shouldn't think of mental symbols as having parts. And the way he does it is by saying that it's much easier to explain. You can give a much simpler explanation of what's going on here if you allow mental symbols to be comprised of other mental symbols that serve as their parts. So intuitively, if we're going to say that the intention 1, it's going to be an intention to a particular mental content, because remember, we're dealing with representational theory of mind, to intend something. So intention 1 is the intention to have your arm go up. The intentional content is your arm goes up. Intention 2 is going to be the intention to hop on 1 foot. So in your intention box is going to be the representation hop on 1 foot. Now the question is, how should we think about this? Should we think of it as what's in the intention box is a single indivisible whole, namely, it's the whole intention, I'll just put a C for complex intention, or should we think of it like this? Intention to, and the reason I'm writing crooked and terrible is they don't want to move because I actually have the camera focused. A and B and H. So what is this? What am I saying? Well, the question is, what is it to intend if you lift your arm up and hop on one foot, and you do that because in your intention box was a content with raise your arm and hop on one foot? Is that content comprised of smaller parts, namely the representation to lift your arm and a separate representation of hopping on one foot put together? Or is it some third representational content that's only true when both of those things are true? So you can think of it this way. The question at this point is, how should we think of intention 3? Let me use a different color. Is it that the content of intention 3, so if intention 3, we're asking what goes in here? This is going to be a question. Intention 3 is the content that goes in here. Is this going to be an indivisible whole? Is it going to be something like this that corresponds to the act of here's your arm, raising your arm and hopping on one foot, and this together corresponds to this? Is this the content? Or is it rather that you have one mental content symbol, arm, and you have a separate content, foot, and this one corresponds to that, this one corresponds to that, and as a whole, it corresponds to this whole thing? Now, again, this is Fodor's trying to argue that Anti is wrong and that symbols can have smaller parts. And this is designed to be his argument for that. And the reason is he's saying it's a lot more parsimonious, aka it's a lot simpler and makes a lot more sense to say that in this intention, when you have a complex behavior, you should think of it as an intention comprised of smaller intentions. And why? Well, because it seems like if you want to say that Anti's right, and really the difference is in this case, you have a new symbol. You had the symbol for arm up, you had a separate symbol for hop on one foot, and then that should be an F, so my symbols are consistent. And then you have a third symbol which corresponds to both of them. Well, Fodor's going to say you very soon have to start saying there are many, 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 many excessive numbers of mental symbols, because then you'll need a separate symbol for hop on one foot, raise one arm, and cluck like a chicken. If you are Fodor and you say that the mental contents can have parts, well, if you say that the content here is this complex symbol comprising these smaller parts, and you can constantly add more complex behaviors coming from your intentions, then what's going to end up happening is it's much simpler to just say each part of the behavior has its own content, and then the entire content is comprised of each smaller part. All right, that just got very confusing, I know. I will talk about this argument in class on Monday very briefly, but hopefully it made sense to some degree. The idea is basically that the reason what's on the table, what Fodor's arguing, is the reason it makes the most sense to say that the language of thought is right is because the language of thought is committed to complex symbols. Non-language of thought is committed to no symbol parts. It's just entire wholes. And what Fodor's saying is in a complex intention in which you say the content of the whole is comprised of smaller parts. So if your intention to raise your arm is what causes the activity to raise your arm, what makes sense is to say you have a representational content, raise my arm, that you're having the intention of. Well, if you have a complex behavior, it seems like your intention to raise your arm and hop on one foot, it seems like it's simpler. Instead of saying there's one symbol that corresponds to that entire action, you instead say you have a complex symbol comprised of parts added together. So instead of saying there's one symbol corresponding to it all, you say there's the symbol for raising your arm, the symbol for hopping on one foot, and those two together comprise the whole, which is the content of raise an arm and hop on a foot. And so he's kind of saying, and this is why he admits the argument's kind of cheap. This is saying like, oh, look, if you admit that it's simpler to explain the complex behavior, raise your arm and hop on one foot, by saying you have a complex intention comprised of parts, well, by that definition, you're already accepting that intentional contents can have parts, and then you've already conceded the game. So that's how that argument's supposed to go. If that didn't make total sense, I'm sorry. I'm doing the best I can here with the bad allergies. And without a live audience, it's hard to make sure that you're understanding. So if you have any questions about this, ask me in class. I'll start talking about it at the beginning of next class. All right. His second argument for language of thought is this. If you actually read psychological explanations, they very often talk about representational contents as things with parts. And just to give the clearest example, this is just going to be a little linguistics. So let's go back to our John loves George. So in written English, it looks like this. But if you actually read a linguistics textbook, what they're going to say is that this is actually a tree. There's a representation of a tree in your head where higher things on the tree stand in a certain relationship to lower things. So specifically, this is going to be the subject. The subject is John. Or more accurately, this is a noun phrase, John. And then this is the verb phrase. And the verb phrase consists of loving and George. Now, as a matter of fact, in English, the best hypothesis is that these trees are real in our head in some sense, because when you actually understand how sentences are grammatical, it looks like we can move the parts around on the tree. So one hypothesis is that WH questions actually involve taking declarative sentences of this structure and moving the parts around. So when you say John loves George, there's a related question, which is who does John love? So in that case, the way linguists explain it is they say what actually happens is this part gets moved to the front and changed into a WH word. And so the actual structure of this sentence is going to be something that looks like this. NP, VP's still here. There's going to be this thing called a phi here. I think this is right. Love. This is going to be loves. And then this is going to go up here to this and becomes a WH of who. So the way if you actually read, the details of this don't matter. The general idea is that when linguists explain how grammar works, they do it in terms of talking about parts of trees being moved around, these symbols being here. So if you actually read it, they're talking as if these things are real. And according to Fodor, you have two options at this point. You either take them at face value and say, yes, these things are real. And when a linguist who's coming up with a good theory says this sort of stuff, they're being serious. But the moment you say they're being serious, you say, yes, mental representations of a sentence have to be things with parts. Because remember, what's up for grabs is, can the contents of a belief, if I believe you said this sentence, can the content of that belief have parts? Well, if you take a linguist seriously and they talk about sentences as trees with parts and comprised of words, then yes, you have to say sentences can have parts. And if sentences can have parts, then the mental content of the belief that somebody uttered that sentence has parts. Or you can go the anti-route, which is to say, this is just loose talk. Linguists might say they're moving parts around a tree, but really that's just shorthand. And what Fodor's response to that is then, okay, this is actually an explanation of what's happening. Just saying, well, it's not like that, this is loose talk, doesn't actually tell you how it works. So if you actually want to explain how thinking works, it looks like the best theory we have right now is that our thoughts have parts and those parts get moved around. So that's the second argument. The third argument, and this is the one that I think is by far the most substantive, and this is the one you hear people talk about the most if you were to take more cognitive science classes or philosophy of mind classes. This is what Fodor calls systematicity. So here's just a general fact about our thoughts. If you can believe that John loves George, it seems like there's many, many other sentences you can also believe. Which ones? It looks like you could understand what it would mean to believe that Sally loves George, that George loves George, that somebody loves George, that I love George, that you love George. that Alexander loves George, that Muhammad loved George, that Jesus loved George. All of these are things you can understand. If you are if you accept the language of thought, this is a very easy fact to explain. The reason that you're able to, if you can think one of these thoughts, you can think every one of these thoughts, is because the thoughts themselves correspond to contents that share parts. This is what I was talking about before. If you have this loves George, then this can be the same in every single case. So if you understand it, John loves George, then it shouldn't, these are just dot, dot, dots. It shouldn't matter what other symbol goes here. So long as you understand these other two, you should be able to understand all these other ones as well. It doesn't matter. You can understand what George loving John, John loving George, George kicking John. It seems like if you understand the general structure, they all follow along, and it makes a lot of sense. If you understand one, you can understand them all. It's systematic. Now, it looks like, however, if you're somebody who doesn't accept language of thought, this is much more difficult. Because as I said, for Auntie, this is the symbol that John loves George. And this is the symbol that somebody loves George. Or no, it was this symbol. This is the symbol that somebody loves George. They have nothing in common. They look nothing alike. From inside the machine, there's no thing which is common to both of them. So in that sense, it's very hard to explain how it is that if you can understand that John loves George, there's many, many other beliefs you can easily think of. If each belief is comprised of parts and those parts can be shared between different contents, it's very simple to explain this systematicity of thought, why you're able to think so many more thoughts. If you say that there's symbols that don't have parts, they're entire units, it's much more difficult to explain why it is. You'd need to give an explanation for this causing this in some sense, but you might be able to give us an explanation for why this one causes this one. But then why would it cause, this one? Why would it be easy to remember this one? Or this one? It looks like this is much harder to explain than this is. Question mark, loves. Each of these are going to be a mental content. And it looks like if you understand this, what's another shape I can draw? I'm running out of shapes here. Heart. So imagine that each of these is a mental symbol for this is someone loves George, this is John loves George, this is Sally loves George. Each of these, it's easy to understand why if you can understand this one, it's so easy to understand this one and many more, because each of them shares parts. And this is possible to say on the language of thought. On the language of thought, to believe that John loves George is to have this entire unit, this entire formula comprised of parts in your belief box. To believe that, or this is someone loves George. To have a belief that John loves George is to have this entire unit in your belief box. Sally loves George is this whole unit. And so why is it so easy to understand one of them? If you understand one, why do you understand them all? Well, they share parts. If, however, you're somebody who doesn't accept the language of thought, then each one of these cannot be understood as made of parts. It's rather, this is John loves George. This is somebody loves George. This is Sally loves George. This is George loves George. Intuitively, if you know what it means that John loves, if you can have the belief that John loves George, it's pretty simple to then have the belief that George loves George, or that Sally loves George, or that someone loves George. But it's much harder if you're saying the units, the symbols that correspond to that state of affairs are indivisible wholes. It's much harder to explain why that would be. You cannot explain the systematicity that you can explain if you say that there's a language of thought, or that each part is comprised of smaller units. All right, those are the three arguments for the language of thought. Now, what I'm going to talk about next time, and what we're going to transition to next week, is there are, however, certain facts that seem very difficult to explain if you take this sort of, we're just going to finish blurry. These sort of explanation seems very difficult to do if I just have to stand directly in front of the camera. That gets it focused again. So if you are going to say that the language of thought is correct, and what it is to think is to have one string of symbols turned into another string of symbols, there's certain sorts of logical errors that human beings make that seem very difficult to explain why we would be so bad at certain things and why we'd make these sorts of mistakes. And it's here that people start to say, maybe it's not all language. Maybe it's not all in a language of thought. Maybe there are some associative or dumber systems left over from our evolutionary ancestors. So what we're going to do next class is I'm going to review some of this stuff about language of thought. And then we're going to compare it to an alternate view that thinks that some things are done in terms of a complex language of thought, specifically a lot of our complex thinking and our complex conscious thinking. But then there's going to be unconscious systems that are running dumb. So this is going to go back to the question from class today of whether, is this going to have to be conscious? Well, we're going to look next time at some people saying, if it's this sort of thinking, this sort of symbol manipulation in a language of thought, it is conscious, but a lot of how we think is not like that. It's a much simpler system. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Hopefully this was able to be understood, even though you weren't here to ask me questions, and even though it's midterm week. But I will see you all next week, and I'm going to be posting these 2 lectures shortly. Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.